Hey everyone, my name is Isaiah and I'm so happy to introduce to you a new video in our series, Continuing Conversations. Continuing Conversations is a mini series that we do after each webinar to give our guests a chance to expand on a topic and give you, the viewer, even more insight so that you can continue the conversation in your community. Today, Matt is sitting down with Clare Anderson, Senior Policy Fellow from Chapin Hall, about her most recent report. Enjoy.
All right, Claire, great to see you again, as always.
It's a delight to be here, Matt. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation today, and I know we're doing a little bit of a follow-up here and a deeper dive from the Investing in Families webinar that you joined us for just earlier this summer. And we wanted to come back and dig in a little bit to the report that you have put out. You've continued to update and put out new versions of your economic and concrete supports report that I think is doing a lot to help shape some of the conversation around how we think about child welfare and child maltreatment and how we support family well-being. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being here today. Before we dive into the meat of it though, let's start by a little bit of a catch up. So this report that you've put out has caught fire, I'd say. So I know that you've been on this sort of virtual national tour presenting what you've been working on. You said yesterday in a conversation that it's gone international now. And so I'm just curious, what do you think's behind all of that? What is capturing people's attention, do you think?
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. It's actually been really quite a surprise at the energy and the interest that the report and the slide deck, the accompanying slide deck on the role of economic and concrete supports in the lives of families as it relates specifically to their involvement with child welfare has had. I have been really surprised and delighted that there is an audience that wants to understand the evidence that has really been generated over the last 20 years on the intersection of poverty, economic hardship, and child welfare involvement. And I think what's happening with the interest in the slide deck and presenting it now in particular is a few things. First, I think it brings together the key findings from research studies over the last 20 or so years. And it elevates them in a way that is understandable, clear, and provides context. So it's all in one place. It brings not all, there's more there. It's been impossible to get it all in a slide deck. But it does bring a new perspective, I think, on the context in which families come to the attention of child welfare, and it really shifts our understanding of the drivers.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's all right, and it's rich, in terms of its content and its scope, and it's clear too about what can we learn and start to think about doing going forward. So we're certainly going to connect this conversation to that report and slide deck so folks can really kind of dive into it and get familiar with what's in it. And so I wanted to read a recommendation that came out of the Away from Home report that just was released recently by Think of Us. And we'll link to that for folks as well. I wanted to read this to you because you shared it with me first, and I think it's good context setting to this conversation. So the recommendation is the system should provide the resources and support necessary to help families live and thrive together safely at home. I'm curious what that meant to you when you read that.
Yeah. This recommendation in the Think of Us Away from Home report is really powerful, I think. And often when we're making policy or practice decisions about youth, it's about their experience in child welfare, in foster care, whether they're in families or whether or not they're placed in a congregate group home or residential type facility, or the extent to which they have the resources they need when they leave foster care as young adults and are ready for adulthood. But this recommendation, emerging from their voices, speaks volumes, I believe, about what we all should be thinking about in terms of helping youth and families to stay together long before those questions about congregate care or readiness for aging out of foster care come into play. And so there's a great deal of interest in listening to families and youth and communities currently, as there should be. And this emerging from a report, listening to youth about what would be helpful is just incredibly important.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I would say, in the spirit of listening to people who've experienced the system, I'll share another quote. One of our friends and colleagues, Clare Anderson, who's part of the Foster Strong team, she wrote a poem called "My Need for Change," and in the poem, she puts out a really powerful question that is, what if we didn't have to wait for bad enough? Why didn't they just help my mama?
Yeah.
And it is, the poem feels sort of like an anthem in some ways to the work that we're all doing, but just really, really profound, that we do have to keep kids safe when we're concerned about child safety, right? But we can also demonstrate that by investing in the well-being of their parents. And I think that's what this report is getting at, and I think that's what Slam is getting at in her poem. So let's dive into your report. So I think that it's becoming more and more clear that we are putting a lot into late stage interventions. Child welfare expenditures are incredibly high, and prevention investments don't nearly match what we spend on the cost of foster care. And so I think that this idea of keeping families together and supporting prevention-based approaches, your report shines a light on that and helps give us some context and some ideas. So what do you think, Claire, in your mind right now, are maybe one or two of the key data points that you've included in your report that you think are maybe some of the more interesting, informative pieces of data as we go forward right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the context of the poem that you just read, they feel even more important. Why didn't they help my mama? And our policy framework is really designed in theory or conceptually to help families. And so the data from the report brings together research from other scholars that really try to look at the associations between policy decisions and family involvement in child welfare. And there were actually 2 or 3 studies that I saw a few years ago that still stick with me. One is that about $1,000 increase in income through the earned income tax credit is associated with an 8 to 10% reduction in child protective services involvement for low-income single mother households. And also related to the earned income tax credit, there's an association when there is a refundable EITC that averages about $400 a year, with a decrease in hospital admissions for abusive head trauma for children under the age of 2, even when child poverty is controlled for. There's a really interesting study on minimum wage that shows for every $1 increase in the minimum wage, there was about a 10% reduction in neglect reports, primarily for children under the age of 12. So those are when we're adding or inserting economic or concrete supports in the lives of families. There's also a really interesting study that relates to temporary assistance for needy families that shows some associations with child welfare involvement when economic supports are removed. States that implemented sanctions of loss of all benefits for not working saw a nearly 13% increase in foster care entries. So I think what we're seeing is this more interrelation of how economic and concrete supports and the decisions that we make in policy making or in operationalizing policy have downstream associations with family involvement with child welfare that are really important for us to consider as we make decisions and as we implement policies.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that makes me think is that, child welfare as a system and child welfare reform efforts, not necessarily just about individual behaviors or parenting styles, right? I mean, it's that the issue is just as much economic and policy, right, and social context as it is individual behaviors or decision making. Is that?
Yeah, I think the evidence points in that direction. I think that we have historically, from a policy framework, organize our policies around bad parenting or intention to not keep kids safe in their own homes, that parents are making bad decisions or that they are bad parents. And so if you look at the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, through that policy, we established mandated reporter laws where we really stood up an entire informal workforce of people who were charged with identifying and reporting to child welfare any suspicion they had about child abuse and neglect. And I think, given the evidence, there is a great deal of rethinking that's needed. How do we redeploy that workforce to support families? How do we have a policy context that thinks first about making sure that families have the resources they need so that children can thrive? Children are well, truly, in the context of their family and in their community.
Right. And, one of the things, and correct me if I'm wrong in misquoting what's in your slide deck, but I think there's something in there that says that family income is the primary or number one indicator of child welfare involvement. And so if I'm getting that right, it gives a lot of context to why this conversation about economic supports is so important.
There are a core set of really strong predictors of child welfare involvement. And they do include family income, economic hardship, housing instability, use of a food pantry, not being able to pay for a medical bill for a family member. And these are all really powerful and interesting indicators of later child welfare involvement. And I think sometimes we think that the message is that poverty equals neglect, and it does not. And I want to be really clear about that. But we do see a constellation of an intersection of poverty and involvement with child welfare that we're understanding in a more nuanced way, and that there is still more to learn about it. But I think at some point we have to name that this is a driver, quite similarly to substance abuse or mental health challenges in families. if you have a mental health problem and you have a number of resources available to you, you're going to meet those needs in a way that likely does not bring you to the attention of child welfare, because you have a number of supports that can wrap around your family. And I think we have to figure out how to do that for many more families, because the scale of human suffering that we have on the back end, when we remove children from their homes because we have not adequately resourced them, or we've not created the context in which they can adequately be resourced, is immense.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say what I said a little bit earlier that you made me think of again, is that our care and concern for the well-being of kids is demonstrated by our investment in their parents. And I think that's what we're talking about here, this intersection between economic hardships and child welfare involvement. It's an important intersection to understand, and I think you're helping us understand this better and differently through the report. And I would just point people back to your slide deck, because there's so much in there. And I think what we wanted to do is just lift up that there's a body of research that you're compiling and putting out that's longstanding, that we should all become really familiar with. And so I want to ask a question here that's a little bit more of an Institute for Family kind of spin on this conversation, which is, there is this intersection between economic hardships and child welfare involvement, and to understand that in a way that can compel us maybe to act. I wonder what your take is on the importance of storytelling or narratives, or seeing families from this point of view, that helps us understand at a more human level what's at stake here, and that we should care about these issues. Is that something that you're seeing on the horizon as a part of this?
Yeah, I think storytelling is important. I think listening to the experience of parents, of children and youth, is critical in helping to contextualize the individual experience. I think what the researchers are doing is bringing the evidence of the associations, and in some cases, actual interventional studies. But that it does not always include how that impacts families on the ground, and hearing their voice, understanding from them what their needs are, helps all of us better understand what the research questions should be, what the nature of the problem is, and how we could go about solving the problem. We develop a theory of change, a hypothesis, a research design, solutions to problems, often without the voice of the people who are most affected in the development of those really critical components that drive policymaking. And I think the more we understand and include the voices of lived experience, the better we all will be.
Yeah, I agree in terms of decision making, and ideating, part of our work, but also from a research and data point of view. I think Brene Brown said it best, in my opinion, when she said, stories are just data with a soul. So stories are data, and they inform us just in different ways. And we had a conversation recently for the podcast that Institute for Families is putting together with Bruce Perry. And as a researcher and a scientist, he said it's, systems change is not going to come necessarily from another, brief or white paper, that we need narrative, we need story to change hearts and minds. And I think it's both. And I think that, it's important that we bring, the power of story and the importance of listening together with, more quantitative data. So I just think there's always opportunities there. So Claire, just thinking going forward, what opportunities do you see as we go forward to move maybe in new directions that focus on parent well-being as a priority?
Yeah. I think that we're seeing some really interesting policy being made at the state level. That's a start. I want to just name a couple. In Kentucky, they have recently increased the amount of funding available for flexible dollars to families in their family preservation and prevention program. So historically, they have provided $500 to families for emergency needs. And they've recently increased that to $1,000 available to families, which is really exciting and interesting in the context of the evidence. And in Washington State, they've recently tightened the legal standards for removing children from their home through the Keeping Families Together piece of legislation, which prevents the state from removing children solely because of certain conditions in the home, including community or family poverty, inadequate housing, mental illness, or substance abuse. And it requires Child Protective Services to show that a child is facing imminent physical harm. So really a rethinking of the policy framework there. We're also, I think, beginning to see states think about the connection between child welfare and their temporary assistance to needy families program. We tried that in the early 2000s, and I think bringing that work back to the fore in the current context of what we have learned over the last 5 to 10 years. So we're starting to think about how do you better integrate or have cross-sector collaboration among the entire social safety net. Really important context in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. The first goal of TANF is to support families so that children can remain safely in their homes. We rarely, I believe, implement our human sector policy frame to act as a child welfare prevention program. But that's what it truly is. Child welfare involvement and the removal of a child from his or her home, from his or her parents, from his or her community, is really among the most intrusive government interventions that we have in our society. It is not to be taken lightly. And how we implement all of our human sector policies could be thought of in that context as a mechanism to reduce involvement with child welfare. And I think just that mental model change across the country could be powerful.
Yeah, super powerful. I mean, I think we do need to do some mental model shifting. But I also love just some of these practical examples that you're sharing with us from Kentucky, from Washington. I know that you had the chance to speak to a legislative committee in Oklahoma not too long ago. So I think there's interest in having these conversations, but there's also some examples already. I mean, I love the bill that you reference in Washington. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a parent recently who had experienced child welfare as a parent. And she shared a thought with me that really stuck with me. And she said, rather than spending so much time thinking about and working on where is this child going to go, maybe we should spend more time thinking and working on what does this family need to stay together, right? And I think what that bill is doing is pointing at some really practical, specific challenges that so many families face, that if we did more to address those challenges of housing and access to services and these sorts of things, we wouldn't have to necessarily remove kids as much as we do from their parents. So yeah, it's important conversations, and I'm just grateful for you to be sharing some of this with us, Claire. And before we end, I wanted to ask you one last question, and this is actually coming from a conversation we had a little while ago, and I think we were talking about sort of state of affairs of a year and a half into a pandemic, and lots of focus on racial injustice in our country, and we're having a conversation. I think you said something to the effect of that your appreciation of the overburdened family, if you will, has changed, and how you see families has changed, and that's driving your work in some ways. And just would love for you to reflect on that a little bit, and share maybe a little bit about what is changing for you.
Sure. It's been quite 18 months or so, and I think we've all, to a greater or lesser extent, touched a universal vulnerability that I think helps us to understand the vulnerability that exists in the turbulence created when families come in and out of poverty, when they experience economic hardship, when resources that were available before are no longer available or are just out of reach. On that last point, I think we've experienced that collectively. Things that we had before were out of reach. And it creates a whole cascade of cognitive load, choices to be made, scrambling about, trying to figure out how to make things happen, where our attention from our loved ones and our warmth and nurturing gets focused elsewhere. And I think that experience, combined with this evidence, having those things happen at the same time, really helped me think about policymaking choice points really differently. And I also went back and looked at the WellBeing Framework that Brian Samuels and I and our colleagues at the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families developed back in 2012 in promoting the social and emotional well-being of children known to child welfare. It was an information memorandum that we sent out to the field when we were at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we focused attention significantly on this theory of change, or a framework. It was a framework for promoting social and emotional well-being. And we focused the field on the well-being of children, which was, it's in the slide deck, you can go look at it. It's on the far right-hand side of the framework. And far over on the left-hand side, a proximal outcome or a proximal set of considerations that are needed for child social and emotional well-being was family income and community context. And it made me appreciate, I think, these things occurring simultaneously, that there was a choice point. We focused on social and emotional well-being of children without giving equal attention at that time to family income. And I think what's changed for me over the course of the last couple of years, given the evidence, given our collective experience, is the need to elevate the evidence around what happens when family income goes up, goes down, and the effect on an association with child welfare involvement.
Well, thank you for this conversation, Claire. It's always good to be with you and to talk to you, and I always learn a lot. And I think I'm coming away from this conversation too, just hopeful. You know, I personally get frustrated with the status quo, and I've always believed that our job is to get better for the kids and families that we serve. And I think the work that you're doing and what you're highlighting in your report and in your deck just gives us a lot to work with and a lot of ideas to pursue. And it gives me hope and optimism about the future, and that we can make real practical investments in families, and by doing so, promote family well-being and child safety at the same time. And I just appreciate what you're doing. So thank you.
And I appreciate what you're doing, Matt. And one thing you said is really important. I just want to highlight it. You used the word status quo. And our decision-making rooted in status quo maintains the current system. And the structural racism embedded within it, and the pushing of families into a system that is not designed to support them and prevent their involvement with child welfare. And so this notion around status quo or business as usual is really important in the current moment. And I just thank you for helping us all to think and explore these ideas in ways that I hope resonate with people.
Absolutely. Well, we will continue to challenge the status quo and build a better future together. So, Claire, great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.